Michael Schumacher's bizarre technique made him the real GOAT of F1. Here's how. 7 world championships and 91 wins over 19 years in Formula 1, Michael Schumacher is still Formula 1's most successful driver. But how did Schumacher come to be so fast and consistent over his long career? And what was it about his driving style that allowed him to dominate? And how does he compare to other great drivers? Stick around for the next couple of minutes to find out exactly what made Schumacher the greatest driver we have ever seen. Since Michael Schumacher was in Formula 1 for such a long time, it would be unfair to say that his driving style did not change over time. Even in between races, the cars are constantly being upgraded each weekend. Over the course of his career, Schumacher also changed between cars each season, and he was also known for changing teams. On top of all of this, it's also a widely known fact that F1 usually has some big regulation changes every 3 years or so. The best drivers we've seen in Formula 1 won't stick to one specific technique. This is because there is no one-size-fits-all driving style, and they really need to adapt to the changing of grip, the changing of balance of each individual car, tire, and track. In Formula 1, it's survival of the fittest, and this adaptation of new driving styles is a skill itself. It's actually quite easy to see the difference in driving style from Schumacher's era of the 90s and 2000s than it is to spot differences in today's generation of F1 drivers. The F1 cars back then, when Schumacher ruled, were a lot less refined than they are today. It's safe to say that the difference in cars from the 1980s to the 2010s are huge. Therefore, it's also safe to say that Schumacher's driving style was different when he started at Jordan and Benetton than where he ended up when he went to Mercedes. But there are still patterns in the driver's style. This is often developed in their early years of karting that become their so-called driving style philosophy. But put in simple terms, why was Schumacher so fast? Here's a short clip of Schumacher himself explaining exactly why he's so quick in 1995.
I think the main ability I have is that I have a good feeling for the limit, a very consistent feeling for the limit, and I'm able to run the car for almost 100% on the limit, and that's probably the difference in style.
In the clip, you can hear Schumacher talking a lot about feel and driving the car on the limits. If you're still watching, please let me take 3 seconds to ask you to consider subscribing to the Real Racing 1 channel. Thank you. But how did driving the car on its limit play out in terms of speed and lap time? Well, let's take a look at some data comparing Schumacher and Johnny Herbert from the British Grand Prix at Silverstone. But first, if you don't know who Johnny Herbert is, he was a British F1 driver who won a total of 3 races. The blue line you see on the screen is the throttle position. You can see the line rising and falling. The top is 100% throttle and the bottom is 0% throttle. You can see that as he's coming up to the corner, it drops to 0 and then gradually increases as he's accelerating out of the turn. You can see that when Schumacher gets on the throttle, it's actually very smooth. Now let's compare data through the Old Bridge corner at Silverstone. It's taken almost flat out at 160 miles per hour. The blue line here is Schumacher, and you can see that he approaches flat out, then gently eases up the throttle, and then again gently adding it back on before lifting it completely and down to 0 to brake for the next turn. Now you can see Johnny Herbert's throttle trace in red. Herbert actually stays on the throttle for longer than Schumacher, but then has a much more abrupt lift which could quite easily unsettle the car, and then bringing that limit we mentioned earlier down. He then gets back on the throttle in quite a messy and rough way. Now let's look at the speed trace. Again, the blue line is Schumacher and the red is Herbert. Schumacher accelerates up to 160 miles per hour, then there's just a little bit of deceleration as he lifts off the throttle before climbing very slightly when he gets back on. And then you can see the speed dropping very quickly as he brakes for the turn. On Herbert's trace, he arrives a little bit slower than Schumacher because he had a worse exit from the previous corner than Schumacher. But his deceleration into the bridge corner is much more because of that big lift off the throttle. But most showing is the steering trace. Again in blue, you can see how Schumacher turns the car into the corner. The trace is flat for a while before he initially turns into the bend. But then in the middle of the line, which is the middle of the corner, you can see the trace zigzag up and down. These are micro corrections Schumacher is making in the middle of the corner, and it demonstrates that Schumacher is on the absolute limit all the way through this turn. On the other hand, Herbert's steering is a lot smoother than that of Schumacher, showing that he isn't quite at the limit. As a result, Herbert loses 0.2 of a second against Schumacher in this corner alone, and 1.5 seconds over this qualifying lap. It's important to say that the steering trace makes it look like Schumacher was hacking away at the steering wheel, which really isn't the case. The adjustments you saw were very delicate because any big movement in the steering wheel would unsettle the car and drop the grip out of it. We hear drivers refer to this limit all the time, but what does it actually mean? When we're talking about the limit of a racing car, I refer to the point in which all 4 tires are giving their maximum amount of grip. You can of course push beyond this point where the car is sliding across the surface surface on the track. But most of the time, especially in modern F1, this is a slower way to drive. And this ability to stay on the limit through each corner was what made Schumacher the GOAT. But what did Schumacher do specifically on the entry of each corner that made him faster than the rest of the grid? Well, it's not as simple as just braking later. All the other drivers know that you need to carry speed into the corner and that you need to brake as late as humanly possible. So being fast is not just about braking as late as you can. There is a fluidity the car needs coming into the apex, coming into the corner, and for that you need feel and understanding of how the car will react, and you need to refine and adapt your style from there. And a lot of people think that being fast in F1 is all about being brave, but that's simply not true, because being brave means that you're not certain about what's about to happen. When you can predict what the car is about to do, when you're certain about how it will react, you don't need to be brave. It's far better to predict when the car will break away rather than havoc slide and need to react to it. When you're reacting, you're always behind the car. Predictability means clear decisions and that you are ahead of the car. This is also widely known as the most intelligent way to drive, and it's a style we've seen in the multiple championship winning drivers because it means extra mental capacity that can be used to think about racecraft strategy and setup rather than simply keeping the car on the road. And this certainly was what made Schumacher the incredible driver that he once was. This was how Michael Schumacher's bizarre technique made him the real GOAT of F1. Now check out my video on Max Verstappen and comment down below what you want us to cover next. Thank you for watching.